Hello, welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Gurney. I'm a published fantasy author with over 11 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Today on the show, we're going to take a look at an email from a listener. I'm going to be reading it for the first time right here on air. It's going to be a live reading. Can't wait. But it has been curated by our editor, Natalia Emmons, and she's let me know this is a good one. So before we get to that, though, first of all, don't forget to subscribe to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. And if you're interested in any of my short fiction, I'm going to plug one of my latest new things toward the end of the show. But for now, let's look at this email. Okay, so I'm bringing it up here. Okay. This comes to us from Gabe, and Gabe writes, "Hi, John and team. I've just started listening to the podcast, and wow, I'm amazed at how you take tough topics and break them down into understandable advice. Thank you for putting this content out there. Commences podcast binge. Something I've been struggling with in my writing lately is humor. Some of the themes in my current project are pretty dark, and I'd like to bring in moments of levity to provide contrast, but I'm not sure how to do that. I'm realizing humor feels nearly as elusive as inspiration. The harder you look, the farther it seems. I don't think of myself as an unfunny person unless my friends and family had been pity-laughing me for years, but I find it's not translating to the page. I've started reading Terry Pratchett and find myself laughing constantly, the puzzling over how exactly he does it. I'd appreciate any frameworks, advice, and resources. Thanks again, Gabe." What a lovely email. Thank you, Gabe, and thanks for writing us and for all that nice stuff you said about me and Natalia and Bridget. We appreciate it. Okay, so let's address this. This is interesting. Humor and dark fiction. It reminds me of this paradox of how humor is like trying to fall asleep, right? Have you ever been trying to fall asleep and the moment you're conscious of the fact that you're trying to fall asleep, it gets harder to fall asleep? Humor is a lot like that. Like when you're trying to be funny, it's so much harder to be funny. But what's funny about that is when you're writing, humor actually can be reverse engineered, at least to some degree. I don't think you can do it completely. I think humor in general is such a tricky thing to nail down, but there's enough of it you can do to at least get started and to address it in a useful way. So I'm really glad Terry Pratchett was brought up. It's a great writer for this sort of thing. I think that Terry Pratchett is so deceptive as a humorous writer because his humor, I think to a lot of people, it can look almost effortless, but if you really inspect it, it is so highly structured. Okay, so for example, one of the things that kind of for me defines Terry Pratchett in terms of his humor, it's almost always coming in through competent characters. I think his funniest characters, they're not bumbling idiots, okay? They are extremely competent people, but they have to deal with absurd situations in a serious way. The example of this would probably be Sam Vimes. Yes, Vimes from Discworld, okay? I haven't read a ton of Discworld stuff, but I do know that Vimes is one of those characters who he doesn't trip over his own feet, right? He is always applying this relentless police procedural logic to a world that happens to have like werewolves and vampires. And I think in that case, the comedy comes from the mismatch between him and the world around him, between the approach of the story and the context of the story. It doesn't come from the character just being like stupid and like a Three Stooges kind of character. I think that is such a good register for dark fiction. Because in dark fiction, if your characters are joking at the darkness, it undercuts the tension that you want a dark fiction novel to have. So if they're being grimly competent, despite how dark everything is around them, but then the universe keeps throwing like absurdities at them, it's so funny. It's like genuinely funny all on its own, but it's also still tense at the same time. I think in Pratchett's case too, you should keep in mind that humor is almost never in the sentence, right? It's in the setup. So I'll try to just like make up a Pratchett like examples. I don't really have any Terry Pratchett stuff around me right now, but let's say you have in this little snippet from a story, like the demon required a virgin sacrifice. Captain Varro had been in the military for 20 years, and Captain Varro knew how to solve logistics problems. he posted a notice in the barracks asking for volunteers who met the criteria of a demon requiring a virgin sacrifice, fully expecting to receive no applicants. But by morning, he had 51 applicants. So, it's not the funniest thing ever because I just made it up. But the humor here, it's not in any individual sentence. It's in the implication. It's what's building up to the punchline. What does it mean that 51 soldiers in an army camp are claiming to be virgins? It's just kind of funny. Pratchett sets up these dominoes and lets you knock them over in your own head. And that's why the humor kind of works too when you want to reread something from him, because the funniness, like, it's all in the setup and the architecture of it all, not just like the punchlines themselves. So if you're writing humor, I think that there are some frameworks you can use to help. In novel writing, they talk a lot about the yes and rule of but also like when you're writing, like Brandon Sanderson talks about this a lot, where you're like, what happens here? Like, do they solve this problem? Yes, but, or they do the yes and, or no and, but it's the whole thing, right? Of like how you chart a story, basically. Dark fiction often operates on the yes, but. So like, yes, there's hope, but everything's terrible. If you know anything about improv, like if people are on a stage and you're at like an improv show, humor typically works on yes and. So yes, this is a desperate situation, and it's also getting more absurd. So, okay, that might not make any sense. So here's an example. Let's say you have like a character hiding from monsters in a closet, okay? The yes, but version would be, she held her breath, but the creature was getting closer. Okay, so it's dark, it's serious. Here's the yes and version. She held her breath. She realized she'd chosen the closet where they stored the squeaky shoes. So the second version here doesn't really undercut the tension, right? Because she's still in danger, but it adds a layer of absurdity that almost kind of creates this relief without breaking the stakes, as long as you do it right. So to that end, I think that humor in dark fiction, it should always be providing some kind of contrast to the dark fiction. What you want to avoid is commentary on the dark fiction. Okay, what that would mean is it's like taking the piss out of the dark stuff that's happening. So the bad version of that would be if you have a character who is making a quip about how dark and terrible everything is. We see this in kind of like a lot of fantasy stuff these days. A lot of YA stuff does this, and a lot of readers don't like it. But the good version of that is if you have a character who's focusing intently on something mundane or absurd while all these terrible things are happening around them. I think Joe Abercrombie is such a good example of this too. In The First Law, for example, you have this thing where Gluckta is being tortured, or has been tortured, and is living in constant pain, but his internal monologue is often just, it's like dry humor. It's bitingly funny because he's observing the absurdities of his world with this kind of like bitter precision. He's not joking about his pain. Like, he's not looking at his pain and being like, I'm in so much pain. He's noticing everything else happening around him with this like dark clarity, right? It's this idea of the mundane in the midst of horror that Pratchett does constantly, where you treat the fantastical as this bureaucratic thing. And bureaucratic stuff tends to be absurd. Look at the movie Brazil, for example. So in your dark project, Gabe, honestly, I think you should be looking for places where the characters have to deal with normal problems, but in abnormal circumstances. So if you have characters who are arguing about who has to carry the cursed artifact, oh, it's so heavy and awkward and it's cursing me. You could have this thing where, if you have to fill out a bunch of paperwork in order to access the forbidden library or something like that. You can have this, the ancient evil is going to awaken, but when it does awaken, it immediately starts dealing with modern zoning laws. I don't know. That kind of got away from me. But anyway, I think that kind of approach to it, at least in your brainstorming, it typically works because you're not mocking or poking fun at the stakes, or at least you shouldn't be. The evil still has to be evil and serious. You should be acknowledging, though, that even in these like apocalyptic scenarios, people still have to deal with annoying logistics of how everyday life is and how absurd it can be. So I think some practical stuff you can do is maybe if you've already written some stuff, try to take a tense scene that you've already written, and instead of changing the stakes or kind of adding in jokes arbitrarily, try to find at least one or two elements that could be absurd if you treated them seriously. So if you had a ritual sacrifice scene, you could add that the priest keeps losing his place in the ancient text because the pages are stuck together, right? Or he has to lick his finger to turn them, which is so absurd. It shouldn't be part of this dramatic, evil ritual, but it is anyway. You could also try taking a character and give him kind of an incompatible priority, right? Because humor often comes from characters caring about the wrong thing at the wrong time. And usually it's because it's not necessarily because they're stupid, it's just because they're consistent people who do weird things. So maybe you have a character trait where you have a character who is very fastidious about etiquette. And then your dark scenario is they have to flee from assassins or something. The humor opportunity then would be apologizing for running through somebody's garden and offering to pay for the damages later because they have so much etiquette, they're so polite, and they're genuinely distressed about how rude they're being, but also they're being chased by assassins. It's absurd. So the key is the character, in this case, they're being serious. It's not a joke. They're not joking to the people they're running away from. They're being serious about how incongruent their reaction to the stakes are, and the stakes are still the same. So another thing you can do too is you can read humor craft books. There's some good ones out there. John Borhaus, Mike Sachs, check out some of their work. They won't make you funny on their own, but maybe they'll help you see more of the structure of humor, which is always pretty learnable. And I think something that people don't love to hear is that, I'll be honest, some writers are naturally funnier on the page than others, right? Same as some people are naturally funnier in conversation. And if humor isn't your strength, you might be better served leaning into other forms of relief. You can focus more on writing beauty and tenderness, competence, absurdity that doesn't necessarily have jokes. You can find your lane, right? Patrick Rothfuss is not a humor writer, but The Name of the Wind is still a book that is very cathartic because Kvothe occasionally gets to be clever and competent in ways that still feel pretty satisfying. So even though that's not the same thing as being funny, it can still serve a similar function. And I think in your specific situation, you said the themes are dark and you want levity. So ask yourself, okay, well, what kind of levity fits my world? Is it gallows humor? Our characters making dark jokes because what else can you do? Everything sucks. Is it absurdist humor where the world is strange and that strangeness is treated as just everyday normal stuff? Is it character-based humor where people are being themselves in these incongruous contexts? Is it situational humor where it's just normal people in absurd situations or absurd people in normal situations? The question is, where does humor live in your story's ecosystem? Is it in the dialogue, right? Does the dialogue have a lot of banter and wit and verbal sparring? It could be in the narration where the narrative voice has kind of a perspective on events. A lot of first person tends to do this. Is it in the world building? Does just the world itself contain a lot of absurdities? Is it in the character behavior where people are doing things that are funny because they're them? So, and another thing too is pay attention to who is funny and why they're funny. Not every character should be funny. In fact, having one character who sees the absurdity of everything while everyone else is serious can be way more effective than trying to make everyone kind of quippy. That's the Marvel problem in a lot of the Marvel movies is everyone kind of starts becoming the Tony Stark quip factory and it loses its steam, right? So if you're looking for other resources, I know I mentioned Pratchett and Joe Abercrombie, some other authors. I really like Christopher Moore. I think that it's a little bit lighter than probably what you're doing, but his work would be good. I think Ben Aaronovitch, the Rivers of London series, could be kind of helpful for this sort of thing to look into. KJ Parker is very darkly funny. If you like short fiction, I'm a fan of George Sanders. He does a lot of great absurdist humor and dark scenarios, not fantasy, but you can find speculative stuff from him. And Kelly Link is good, with fairy tales and stuff like that. Definitely treats it seriously with its own kind of humor. So yeah, overall, I think the fact that maybe you're funny in person or not unfunny or whatever you said, but not on the, so you're saying the way that you're funny in real life doesn't match how you are on the page. Okay. To me, that suggests that you're trying too hard. You're trying to write humor rather than letting it emerge from the character and the situation. So my advice is to stop trying to be funny and instead just give your characters strong, specific perspectives and then put them in situations where their perspective creates a little bit of friction, and then let them be themselves just consistently, even when it creates these unpredictable situations, actually, especially if it does that. So if you do that, humor could honestly show up on its own. And if it doesn't, you'll at least have characters who feel real enough that the readers will care about them, whether they're laughing or not. So, okay, that'll do it. Thank you so much for the question. And thank you, listeners, for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Hope to be back soon. And a real quick plug, I have a new short story out in a horror anthology, pretty fitting. It's not humorous, don't worry. So you won't be able to see how bad I am at it. But it's in an anthology. It's called If I Die Before I Wake, Tales of Cryptid Chaos, Volume 10. And this is through Crystal Lake Publishing and Sinister Smile Press. I'm holding the hardcover in my hands right now. It's such a beautiful cover. It's so nice. There are a bunch of other great writers in here for sure. My story in this is called No One Remembers Him. It's about a Saguapa. So if you're curious about kind of Caribbean cryptids and all the other stuff, there's tons of cryptids in this. Definitely pick it up. It's available on Amazon. You can check it out in paperback as well. Hope you do. I would love the support. Okay, that's all from me. See you all on the next one, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.